The sheriff found her in my hydrangea bushes at 2:15 a.m., clutching a clipboard, wearing night vision goggles, and whispering HOA bylaws like a Gregorian chant. I was in my bathrobe, holding a lever-action rifle and a steaming mug of decaf. She'd called the cops on me twice that week. But this time, I called them. And now, she was explaining to law enforcement why she'd scaled my fence in tactical Crocs. My name's Wesley Tilden, but everyone calls me Wes. I'm 49, a widower, and a former Air Force logistics tech. I moved to Cypress Hollow, a planned community with enough cul-de-sacs to confuse Google Maps, thinking it'd be quiet, peaceful. A place to rebuild after losing my wife to cancer 3 years ago. The neighborhood seemed perfect with its tree-lined streets and well-maintained parks. I bought a modest 2-story colonial at the end of Magnolia Court, far enough from the main road to avoid traffic noise but close enough to the community center that I could walk there for the occasional poker night with the other veterans in the neighborhood. I installed blackout curtains because my years in the service taught me the value of good sleep. I grew tomatoes in neat rows along my back fence, finding solace in the simple act of nurturing something from seed to harvest. I kept to myself mostly, exchanging polite waves with neighbors but avoiding the drama that seemed to plague suburban life. My idea of wild was grilling pork chops at 11 p.m. while listening to classic rock through my earbuds, careful not to disturb anyone. I thought I'd found my sanctuary, a place where I could heal and maybe find some peace in my remaining years. But Jeanette Carlson, HOA president and self-proclaimed architectural harmony enforcer, took my privacy personally. She ran the HOA like a Cold War surveillance state with a Fitbit, tracking every minor infraction with the dedication of someone who'd clearly never had a real job. At 63, she was a retired middle school vice principal who brought that same authoritarian energy to our quiet neighborhood. She lived 4 houses down in a pristine white colonial that looked like it had been pressure-washed daily, with a lawn so perfectly manicured you could use it as a putting green. Our war began when I denied her entry to my backyard during her routine inspection. She'd shown up on a Saturday morning, clipboard in hand, demanding access to check for compliance violations. I was polite but firm when I told her that without proper notice and a legitimate reason, she wasn't entering my property. Her eye twitched, a vein pulsing in her forehead as she gripped her clipboard so hard her knuckles went white. She called it a gross obstruction of protocol, her voice rising to that particular pitch that only comes from someone unused to being told no. I called it trespassing and gently closed my gate in her face. Within days, I was fined $3,000 for alleged violations that would have been laughable if they weren't so expensive. The first was for an unapproved garden structure, which was actually just a simple tomato cage I'd bought at the local hardware store. The second fine was for aggressive ornamentation, referring to a garden gnome my late wife had given me as a joke years ago. Yes, the gnome was flipping the bird, but it was tucked behind my rose bushes, barely visible unless you were actively trespassing to look for it. The third violation was for unauthorized avian congregation because apparently 3 bird feeders exceeded the HOA's limit of 2 per household, a rule I'm certain she invented on the spot. Then came the letters, typed on official HOA letterhead, certified mail that required signatures, and somehow all smelling faintly of vanilla-scented rage. Each one outlined new violations with increasing creativity. My mailbox was half an inch too tall. My driveway had oil stains that were deemed unsightly despite being barely visible. My trash cans were visible from the street for 37 minutes instead of the approved 30-minute window. She'd calculated this down to the minute, which meant she was literally timing my trash collection routine with a stopwatch. She'd loiter outside my house at all hours, peeking over the fence with the determination of a Cold War spy, measuring grass height with a tape measure like a deranged Boy Scout working on the world's most pathetic merit badge. My motion sensor lights were triggered so often I started calling them Jeanette beacons, and I could practically set my watch by her evening patrols. She'd walk past my house at exactly 7:15 p.m., 8:30 p.m., and 10:45 p.m., always slowing down to scrutinize my property with the intensity of a detective at a crime scene. One neighbor, Bob from 2 doors down, said he saw Jeanette inspecting my gutters with military-grade binoculars while standing on a stepladder she'd dragged from her garage. Another swore she had a drone labeled HOA Recon that she'd fly over backyards during dinnertime, though no one had managed to get photo evidence yet. The woman who lived behind me mentioned seeing Jeanette taking photographs of my backyard from her second-story window with a telephoto lens that looked like it belonged on a nature documentary. Things escalated dramatically when she reported me to animal control for harboring a feral bobcat. The dangerous wild animal in question was my Maine Coon, General Meowster, who weighs 23 pounds and likes to sunbathe dramatically on my deck, stretching out like he's posing for a calendar photo. When Animal Control showed up, the officer took one look at General Meowster, who was wearing a bow tie collar and purring loud enough to hear from 10 feet away, and started laughing so hard he had to lean against his truck. Animal Control left still chuckling, but Jeanette was not amused. Her face turned a shade of purple I'd only seen on exotic eggplants as she watched them drive away without issuing any citations. So she called code enforcement the very next day, alleging I had unregistered defensive infrastructure on my property. The translation of this absurd claim was that I had a storm shelter with a padlock, something that had been on the property when I bought it and was perfectly legal according to actual city ordinances, not the fictional one she seemed to be creating in her head. I had enough of this nonsense. That weekend, I installed security cameras that were discreet but covered every angle of my property. I made sure they were all perfectly legal and properly registered with the local police department, following every guideline to the letter. I even put up small signs noting that video surveillance was in use, though I made them just small enough that Jeanette would have to trespass to read them clearly. And when footage caught her climbing over my 6-foot privacy fence at night, clipboard in hand and wearing what looked like tactical gear from an army surplus store, I didn't hesitate to dial the sheriff's direct line. Sheriff Drummond showed up 10 minutes later in his patrol car, lights flashing but no siren, which somehow made it more ominous. He's ex-Marine, built like a vending machine with arms, and was absolutely thrilled to arrest someone for a real reason instead of dealing with another noise complaint about someone's wind chimes. He found Jeanette still in my backyard, now trying to measure the distance between my tomato plants with a ruler while muttering about agricultural density violations. Jeanette tried to spin it with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences before. She claimed she had implied consent via subdivision charter, waving her clipboard like it was a legal document blessed by the Supreme Court itself. The sheriff raised an eyebrow that could have won awards for skepticism and said in his gravelly voice that sounded like he gargled with gravel, "Lady, that's not how laws or fences work. You can't just climb over someone's fence because you're on some HOA power trip." She was charged with criminal trespassing and stalking, the second charge added when I showed the sheriff my documentation of her repeated harassment over the past 3 months. Her HOA privileges were immediately suspended pending investigation by the state attorney general's office, who'd apparently been building a case against her for months based on complaints from other homeowners. My $3,000 in fines were now under review, which the prosecutor told me was legal speak for about to become toilet paper. The footage went viral within hours. My Ring doorbell had caught her saying "I am the law" in her best Judge Dredd impersonation while she was arguing with Sheriff Drummond, complete with a dramatic finger point that would have been intimidating if she wasn't wearing Crocs with HOA-themed gibbets. It made the local news by the next morning, and someone with too much time and talent had auto-tuned it by that afternoon. Now there's a TikTok remix with 3.8 million views called "I Am the Lawn," and I've heard teenagers playing it from their phones at the grocery store. Turns out, she'd fined dozens of homeowners over the years fraudulently, pocketing some of the money for personal use while using the rest to fund her elaborate surveillance equipment. The forensic accountant found she'd embezzled nearly $40,000 over 5 years, spending it on everything from high-tech cameras to a subscription to a private investigation database she used to run background checks on new residents. HOA board elections were held 2 weeks later. She ran from her position of house arrest, sending campaign flyers that somehow made it worse. She lost by a margin so large that even her husband voted against her. A group of residents calling themselves the Mulch Mutiny threw a block party the day her resignation letter was read aloud at the emergency HOA meeting. There was cake from the fancy bakery downtown, chocolate with buttercream frosting that said "No trespassing" in elegant script. Someone had hired a mariachi band, and old Mrs. Henderson from Oak Street did a victory dance that went viral on its own merit. The local news covered that too, calling it the sweetest revenge in suburban history. Jeanette now resides 3 neighborhoods over in a rental after having to sell her house to pay legal fees and restitution. She's banned from holding any HOA office for life per court order and has 3 years of probation. She also received 6 months in county jail for the embezzlement charges and had to pay back every fraudulent fine with interest, totaling over $60,000. When the judge read the sentence, she fainted dramatically in the courtroom, and even her lawyer looked relieved it was over.